It all started with a single email that landed in John's inbox, its subject line screaming in bold, "Urgent, notice of violation, immediate action required." The message came from Linda Harper, the self-appointed enforcer of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association, a woman who seemed to live for the thrill of catching neighbors in some minor infraction. John, a retired contractor, and his wife, Elizabeth, had moved to their sprawling Montana ranch to escape the noise of city life, but Linda's email made it clear that peace was not on her agenda. She claimed their newly built barn violated HOA regulations, a barn that wasn't even on HOA land. What followed was a showdown that spiraled into chaos, with Linda calling the cops to evict Elizabeth from their own property, unaware that Elizabeth wasn't just any homeowner. She was the director of the FBI. John sat at his kitchen table, sipping black coffee, when the email popped up on his phone. It was a crisp September morning in 2024, and the Montana air carried the first hints of fall. He and Elizabeth had purchased the 50-acre ranch 2 years prior, drawn to its rolling hills and the promise of solitude. The property sat just outside the Pinewood Estates subdivision, a cluster of upscale homes governed by an HOA that seemed to think it ruled the entire county. Their ranch, however, was not part of the HOA's jurisdiction, a fact clearly stated in their deed and confirmed by the county recorder's office. Yet, Linda Harper, the HOA president, had other ideas. The email was a masterpiece of bureaucratic outrage. Linda cited unauthorized construction of their barn, claiming it violated setback requirements and aesthetic guidelines. She demanded immediate demolition and threatened fines, liens, and further legal action if they didn't comply within 48 hours. John chuckled at first, assuming it was a mistake. Their barn, a sturdy red structure built to house Elizabeth's horses, was well within their property lines, and they'd secured all necessary permits from the county. He forwarded the email to Elizabeth, who was in D.C. for work, expecting her to laugh it off too. Elizabeth's response was short: "Call the county and confirm our permits. Don't engage with her yet." Her tone was calm but firm, a hallmark of her leadership style. As the FBI director, Elizabeth was used to handling high-stakes situations with precision, and this seemed like a minor annoyance. John did as she suggested, contacting the county planning office, where a clerk confirmed their permits were in order and the HOA had no authority over their land. Armed with this, John replied to Linda's email, politely explaining that their property wasn't under HOA jurisdiction and attaching a copy of their deed for clarity. Linda's reply came within hours, dripping with condescension. She insisted the HOA's covenants extended to adjacent properties to maintain the neighborhood's character, and warned that she'd escalate the matter to the HOA's attorney. John, now irritated, called Elizabeth again. She was in a meeting but texted back, "Let her escalate. We're in the clear." John trusted her judgment but couldn't shake the feeling that Linda wasn't going to let this go. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived, demanding a meeting with the HOA board. John ignored it, figuring Linda would tire herself out. But the next morning, he woke to find a bright orange notice taped to their front gate, declaring the barn an eyesore and threatening legal action. A neighbor, Tom, who lived in Pinewood Estates, stopped by to warn John that Linda was rallying other HOA members, claiming the barn lowered property values. Tom, a retired mechanic who'd clashed with Linda over his vintage car collection, said, "She's got a vendetta now. Watch your back." John wasn't worried yet. He and Elizabeth had dealt with worse than an overzealous HOA president. Elizabeth had spent decades climbing the ranks of the FBI, from field agent to director, navigating political minefields and high-profile cases. A small-town HOA dispute was nothing compared to testifying before Congress or overseeing national security operations. Still, John called her to update her, and she promised to handle it when she returned from D.C. in a week. That's when things took a turn. Linda showed up at the ranch unannounced, driving her pristine white SUV right up to the gate. John was in the barn, mucking stalls, when he heard her honking. He walked out, wiping sweat from his brow, to find Linda standing at the gate, clipboard in hand, her lips pursed like she'd just tasted sour milk. She wore a blazer and a name tag that read Pinewood Estates HOA President, as if it carried the weight of a federal badge. "Mr. Thompson," she said, voice sharp, "your barn is in violation, and I'm here to serve you with a formal eviction notice for non-compliance." John blinked, certain he'd misheard. "Eviction? This is our property. You've got no authority here." He kept his tone even, but his patience was thinning. Linda thrust a stack of papers at him, claiming the HOA had voted to enforce compliance, and that failure to demolish the barn would result in their removal from the property. John refused to take the papers, pointing out that their ranch wasn't part of Pinewood Estates. Linda's face reddened, and she snapped, "You don't get to decide that. The HOA has standards, and your eyesore is ruining our community." John crossed his arms. "Lady, you're on my land now. I suggest you leave." Linda didn't budge. Instead, she pulled out her phone, dialed 911, and reported an uncooperative property owner obstructing HOA enforcement. Within 20 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies pulled up, their cruiser kicking up dust on the gravel drive. John watched, half amused, half exasperated, as Linda gestured wildly, pointing at the barn like it was a crime scene. The deputies, both young and visibly confused, approached John. Deputy Harris, the senior of the two, asked for his side of the story. John explained the situation, showing them the deed and permits on his phone. Harris nodded, flipping through the documents, while his partner, Deputy Klein, tried to calm Linda, who was now ranting about property value destruction and rogue homeowners. Harris radioed the county office, which confirmed John's story. The ranch was outside HOA jurisdiction. "Ma'am," Harris said to Linda, "this property isn't under your HOA. You've got no legal standing here." Linda's jaw dropped, but she doubled down, insisting the deputies arrest John for defying community standards. Klein, barely suppressing a grin, told her they couldn't arrest someone for building a barn on their own land. Defeated but undeterred, Linda stormed off, vowing to take this to the top. John thought that was the end of it. He called Elizabeth, who found the story mildly amusing but told him to keep her posted. She was due back in Montana in 2 days, and John figured Linda would slink away once her bluff was called. He underestimated her persistence. The next morning, he found another notice on the gate, this time claiming the HOA had filed a lawsuit against them for nuisance and devaluation. Attached was a letter from an attorney John had never heard of, demanding $10,000 in damages and immediate demolition. Now John was mad. He called the attorney, who turned out to be Linda's cousin, a small-time lawyer from Bozeman with no experience in property law. The lawyer admitted the lawsuit was a precautionary measure and suggested John settle to avoid court. John hung up and called Elizabeth, who was mid-flight back to Montana. Her response was curt, "I'll deal with it when I land." Elizabeth arrived home that evening, her black SUV pulling into the drive just as the sun dipped below the mountains. She was still in her DC attire, tailored suit, hair pulled back, exuding the quiet authority of someone who'd stared down senators and criminals alike. John filled her in over dinner, expecting her to brush it off as a nuisance. Instead, her eyes narrowed. "She called the cops?" Elizabeth asked, her voice low. John nodded. "And tried to evict us." Elizabeth set down her fork. "All right. Let's end this." The next morning, Elizabeth drove to the Pinewood Estates Community Center, where the HOA held its monthly meetings. John went along, curious to see how she'd handle it. The meeting was already in progress, with Linda at the front, addressing a dozen residents about the urgent threat posed by the Thompsons' barn. Elizabeth walked in, unannounced, her FBI credentials clipped to her blazer. The room fell silent. "Mrs. Harper," Elizabeth said, her voice calm but cutting, "I understand you've been attempting to evict my husband and me from our property." Linda froze, her clipboard trembling slightly. Elizabeth introduced herself, not by title at first, but as a homeowner who'd been harassed by baseless claims. She laid out the facts. Their ranch was not HOA property, their permits were valid, and Linda's actions bordered on legal harassment. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "I'm Elizabeth Thompson, director of the FBI. I'd like to understand why you felt it necessary to involve law enforcement in a matter you have no authority over." The room erupted in whispers. Linda stammered, her face paling as she realized who she'd been antagonizing. She tried to backtrack, claiming it was a misunderstanding, but Elizabeth wasn't having it. She produced a copy of the HOA's bylaws, which she'd obtained from the county, and pointed out that their jurisdiction ended at the subdivision's boundary. She then mentioned the sheriff's report, which documented Linda's 911 call as a misuse of emergency services. "I suggest you retract your lawsuit and cease all contact with us," Elizabeth said, her tone leaving no room for debate. "If this continues, I'll have no choice but to involve federal authorities to investigate potential harassment and abuse of process." Linda nodded mutely, her authority crumbling. The other HOA members, sensing the shift, began murmuring about Linda's overreach. One even suggested a vote to replace her as president. By the next day, the lawsuit was withdrawn, and Linda sent a formal apology, claiming she'd misinterpreted the HOA's authority. John and Elizabeth heard through Tom that Linda had stepped down as HOA president, citing personal reasons. The barn still stands, and the Thompsons' ranch remains a haven of peace, minus one overzealous neighbor. Elizabeth never mentioned her FBI role again, but word spread through Pinewood Estates, ensuring no one dared tape another notice to their gate.